Welcome to part 1 of this series on immigration from Hamburg and Bremen in the 19th and 20th century. My name is Andrea Benschneider and I've been a professional genealogist in Germany, based in Hamburg, since 2004. So for the past 17 years, my team and I have helped many people gain access to their German ancestry. In this first part, I will give you some historical background information on the immigration and what it was like to be an immigrant. And in the second part, I will talk about the research possibilities. There's also a document which gives you some websites and more information to refer to actually find your immigrant ancestors. So enjoy the presentation. So I'm talking about basically that there were 3 ports in Germany that were of interest. With Hamburg, the records exist from 1850 through 1934, and 5 million people immigrated through the port of Hamburg. The port of Bremen was actually more important in a sense that between 1832 and 1939, more than 7.2 million people left the European continent to go overseas. There's also the small port of Stettin, which is nowadays in Poland, and between 1869 and 1901, about 20,000 passengers left that port. And again, in the second part of this series, I will talk about how to gain access to the passenger list. The German immigration, particularly in the 19th century, was 90% of all passengers or immigrants left for the United States, with New York being the main port there. Only about 10% emigrated to Australia, Canada, the South America, or even Africa. The German immigration began in 1683 with 13 Quaker families from Krefeld, and since then 7 million Germans left the continent. And particularly the 100-year time frame, 1820 through 1920, was the most important time there, and 5.5 million Germans left. The other numbers you calculated correctly. There were 12 million people between Hamburg and Bremen. But then you also had Eastern Europeans, Russians, and people from Scandinavia immigrate through the port of Hamburg or Bremen. So there were some reasons why people left, and the first most important reason was that people sought to improve their social and economical standard of living. Usually they were with an increased population and the coming industrialization that led to unemployment, particularly in the Eastern Prussian provinces. So that again found its filter in the immigration. And so people left from there to go to other places, to go to other countries. The majority of the lower and lower middle class population in Germany was never able to actually own their own land. And so land was relatively cheap in North America and in Australia. So that was definitely a reason why people went there. Usually it was also that particularly poor families usually were, the passage ticket oftentimes was paid by the poor relief fund of their hometown, because it was cheaper to once pay for a travel ticket than to really feed and take care of a family for the rest of their years in the hometown. So there were also the gold rush in California and Australia certainly was of interest. There was also a need of qualified workers abroad. So that was a reason why particularly young unmarried men and qualified workers left the European continent to look and gain their fortune, hopefully, abroad. There were also advertising in newspapers, like here ads for going to Brazil or for the post-steam vessel traveling between the port of Hamburg and New York. So there was like reasons everyone was basically informed about this. And so since so many people left, there was not one community in Germany that was not affected by this. So, but if you decided now to immigrate, you had a couple of choices to make, such as which port do you use to depart the continent? Do you sail directly or indirectly? Do you take a sailboat or a steam vessel? And usually the immigration routes had to do with either the advertisement that you saw, so that you felt it was cheaper or easier to go a certain way. The other alternative was also what was easier to get to. So since only in the 1840s the railroad system started in Germany, before that you could only travel by carriage or take a river. And so basically Hamburg was more important for passengers from the north of Germany, Northern Europe, also Eastern Europe, Russia, Poland, etc. While Bremen was more interesting for people traveling up the Rhine River. So you have the south of Germany and the west of Germany, also maybe some areas in France and Switzerland, that for whom Bremen was the more convenient port to depart from. Stettin obviously was in the north, located on the Baltic Sea. So people from Pomerania, Russia, and Scandinavian countries traveled through there. And on the next map, I try to show you and explain to you what the direct and indirect immigration means. So you have here, if you follow my cursor, you have here the port of Hamburg, here is Bremen. Stettin was located about here. So if you traveled from Stettin, you had to go through the Baltic Sea around Denmark to go overseas. The port of Bremen basically only served direct immigration, which means you embarked on the vessel in Bremen, then you traveled, sailed all the way to New York and disembarked in New York, or respectively the final port of destination. That was direct immigration. Hamburg was also known for additionally the indirect immigration, which meant you embarked in Hamburg, but then you would sail to Hull or Leith in Great Britain. And if you sailed to Hull, then usually you would disembark in Hull, take all your belongings on a train, travel to Liverpool, and then embark on the ship that would then take you to your final destination, most of the time New York. And with Leith, you would then take the train to Glasgow and would go across the Atlantic from there. So obviously that was a lot more inconvenient and took longer, but it was also a lot cheaper. Here are some of the destinations from 1870 from the ships where immigrants went to in 1870. So you see New York is the most popular destination, followed by Baltimore and New Orleans, and you only have a couple of other ports there, but you have only 2 or respectively 3 passengers going outside of North America. And you see also from the 46,700 immigrants, about 3/4 traveled on a steam vessel, and I will show you a picture later, and 1/4 traveled on a sailboat. In Hamburg 2 years prior to that, in 1868, you also had close to 50,000 immigrants, with New York being the most popular destination. But you see also the second most popular destination is Brazil, followed by Canada. And here you also see a lot of passengers going to South, respectively Middle America, Mexico, West Indies, Australia, Africa, and even China and East India. And here you have other numbers. Here you see the steam vessels. You see also sailboat, about 2/3 going on a steam vessel, 1/3 of the passengers traveling on a sailboat. But here you also have quite a number of people choosing the indirect route, going to Hull and then continue on from Liverpool. And you also have 123 passengers on a so-called non-immigrant vessel. These are basically regular freight ships, where some, like maybe a cabin or 2, was filled with passengers who then would immigrate to a destination the ship was going to. Usually they were not the typical routes like New York or the main ports that the regular immigration vessels would sail to. They rather have the more unusual routes going to then Asia, etc. before an immigrant left Germany, one had to also take care of a couple of things, such as obtaining a discharge certificate, or respectively getting the permission to immigrate from the lord, basically, or the ruler of the state that you lived in. The chances were, however, that if you were denied that permit, then you were in trouble, because then you couldn't go away, because obviously the authorities knew you were planning to leave. And in order to get this permit, also respectively this discharge from your citizenship there, you also you lost your rights in residence. You needed to prove that you have no outstanding debts. That was oftentimes published in newspapers, so that if anyone had anything against you, like if you owed any money to anyone, that they would know about your intention to leave. Also, particularly of interest was for the young men, did they serve in the military or not? So particularly when the Prussians took over some parts of northern Germany, and many of the young men were supposed to be drafted into the military. That was one reason why they left, and they changed their names in the passenger list, like using a different first name, one of the 3 first names they usually had, or they entered a different age in the record. So to kind of like hide and get away without the authorities finding out about that. So, but basically the cruise lines or the shipping lines did not care about all of that. They only were interested, did you pay for your ticket or not? And did you have the money for that? And also one important thing, you did not need to have a passport to immigrate, because you only needed to have a passport if you planned on returning to Germany again. So since most of these poor immigrants that left had no intention, respectively, certainly no money on come back to Germany, so most of them never filed for a passport. Passports were usually only for those who traveled on business or on leisure vacations. Here are the costs that were involved to travel or to immigrate. So we have here the cost for a voyage in 1851, 3 persons, so 2 adults, 1 child, leaving from Mecklenburg to New York. The whole cost was 188 thalers, and that included the cost of the ship ticket, board and lodging aboard the ship. You had to bring your own mattresses, cooking, eating utensils, covers. So imagine schlepping that on your train when you travel indirectly. And you for 1 ship, train, and 2nd ship, and they have a couple of children with you, so that was certainly no fun. You needed some travel and hand money. You needed some postage or for certificates for carriage, certain clothing, etc. So that was 188 thalers in 1851. And here is now a listing of the annual income. So if you were a merchant in Rostock in Mecklenburg, you certainly had no problem paying for your 188 thalers. But if you were a teacher, you already had a problem, because you didn't make enough money in 1 year to have that, to pay for this. And then if you were a fisher or just a worker, then you see you really were in trouble, and that was difficult to pay for this travel. So that's why also, particularly when it came to going to South America, there oftentimes was the possibility that you worked as indentured servants. So usually the captains and owners of big farms, haciendas in South America, they kind of paid for the passage ticket. And then the immigrants had to spend several years, like 5 years and more, on this farm, on this hacienda, and work off the cost of their passage, basically. What I found interesting also was, like, how long did it really take to travel in those days? So in 1868, going by sailboat to New York, the shortest journey was 29 days and the longest was 77 days. So that's already long and possibly rather inconvenient. But if you look at Australia, where it took anywhere between 76 days and 108 days, so more than 3 months, 3.5 months to get there, and they really did not have very nice accommodations. It's nothing compared to the cruises that you can take today. So that was really, you really had to be desperate to go on such an adventure. So when I'm talking about sailboats and respectively steam vessels in 1868, then this was what you had to expect when you came to the port. So you basically, you had a sailboat, and then there was this little auxiliary motor, and you have to see this little bit of smoke there, and that was what was considered a steam vessel. So that's far from like when you think of like Titanic or QE2 or whatever. So it's like far away from that. So only in later years you have this, what comes closer to what you think of today when you think of going on a cruise or on an ocean ship. So that was the Saxonia. That was one of the Hamburg vessels. And now about what it was like to travel. So the average poor passenger or immigrant traveled in steerage. So they had these bunk beds in there. There were hundreds to a couple of thousand people aboard. And usually on the way over, they had the passengers in the steerage area. Then on the way back, they would take down the beds and load wood or whatever, grains or whatever they would bring from North America or wherever the destination was back to Germany. So usually the passengers, think of the 108 days going to Australia, would live below deck, and then only a couple of hours a day they would have a chance to actually go up on the fresh air and breathe a little bit. So I guess you really do get to know your co-passengers a lot and really have to get along well with them. So thank you so much for your attention, and don't miss to look at part 2 for the research possibilities. Thank you.